Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The calm before the storm. The gentle hum of the airplane engines was a familiar sound to Angela Hamilton, a soothing backdrop to her thoughts. She was used to the routine of air travel, often finding herself on planes for work, personal trips, and everything in between. But this time, as she sat in the first-class cabin of Flight 786, something felt different, something in the air, though it wasn't the typical turbulence she had experienced hundreds of times before. Angela sat with grace, her fingers lightly resting on her leather-bound journal, a longtime companion she had taken on every flight for years. There was something about the rhythm of the plane's movement that helped her focus. With a pen in hand, she jotted down her thoughts, ideas, and dreams in the quiet solitude that only a flight could provide. The world outside the windows was a vast expanse of clouds, a metaphor for the clarity she sought in her life. Here, high above the earth, she could escape the noise that often drowned out her inner voice. But today, as Angela settled into her seat, the weight of the world felt a little heavier. Perhaps it was the ongoing tension from her recent business ventures or the complex conversations she had with investors and stakeholders that loomed over her mind. For once, the serenity of the sky was not enough to quell the storm inside her. Angela was no stranger to challenges. As a successful entrepreneur and philanthropist, she had faced obstacles at every stage of her life. From growing up in a neighborhood where dreams often went unfulfilled to building a multi-million-dollar business empire that championed diversity and inclusivity, Angela had overcome adversity time and time again. But the challenges she faced in the business world often paled in comparison to the subtle, and not so subtle, forms of prejudice she experienced every day. She had long since learned to ignore the sidelong glances, the whispered judgments, the insinuations of others that she didn't belong where she was. As a Black woman, it was an unfortunate reality that she carried with her into every room and on every flight. Even in the upscale surroundings of first class, Angela had come to expect the occasional suspicious glance, the unspoken question of how she could possibly afford such luxury. Today, however, something felt different about the attention she was receiving. From the corner of her eye, Angela noticed the flight attendant, slim, with sharp, calculating eyes, casting frequent glances in her direction. At first, Angela didn't think much of it. Perhaps the attendant was just doing her job, ensuring that everyone was comfortable. But there was something in the way the attendant's gaze lingered that made Angela uneasy. It wasn't just a casual glance, it was as if the woman was sizing her up, scrutinizing her every move. Angela brushed it off at first. She had encountered similar reactions before. Being a successful Black woman in predominantly white spaces often meant that she was watched, judged, and sometimes questioned. But she had long since learned how to navigate those spaces with poise, using her grace and confidence to disarm those who doubted her. Still, today, there was an unmistakable discomfort in the air, one that she couldn't quite shake. As the plane ascended, mild turbulence began to rattle the overhead compartments, a common occurrence on flights. Angela tucked her pen into the spine of her journal and gripped the armrests lightly, feeling the familiar sensation of the plane adjusting to the wind currents. It wasn't unusual for the plane to sway a little, it was a routine part of air travel. Angela noticed that a few other passengers shifted in their seats, their discomfort evident in the way they clutched the armrests or adjusted their posture. But, for the most part, the turbulence seemed harmless. What Angela didn't realize was that, in the eyes of some passengers, the turbulence had little to do with the weather. It was the unspoken tension in the cabin, a feeling that something was out of place, something that couldn't be ignored. As the plane moved through the clouds, the atmosphere began to change, not just because of the turbulent weather, but because of the tension that was building silently between the passengers. Then, a moment that would change everything occurred. The flight attendant returned, her movements swift, almost mechanical. She approached Angela with a smile that seemed to strain against something deeper, something more calculating. Angela felt a sudden, sharp sense of unease, but she tried to ignore it, assuming that it was simply the result of a stressful job. However, the attendant's next words confirmed Angela's growing sense that something wasn't quite right. "Excuse me, ma'am," the attendant said, her voice tight. I'm going to need you to fasten your seatbelt, please. There's going to be some additional turbulence soon, and it's better to be prepared. Angela, caught off guard, nodded in agreement. It was standard procedure, and she had no reason to doubt the attendant's instructions. But as she buckled her seatbelt, the attendant's gaze never left her. The uncomfortable tension between them seemed to grow with every passing moment. Is everything okay? Angela asked, her voice steady, trying to mask the concern she felt. You seem a little distracted. The attendant hesitated, then quickly looked away, her posture stiffening as she muttered something about checking on the other passengers. Angela didn't know why, but something about the interaction didn't sit right with her. It felt like an unwarranted interruption of the calm she had sought on this flight. But she pushed the feeling aside, choosing instead to focus on her journal and the notes she had been making earlier. As the plane continued to climb, the mild turbulence intensified. The rattling of the overhead compartments grew louder, and a few passengers exchanged uneasy glances. Angela, though no stranger to turbulence, felt the unease around her begin to seep into her own thoughts. The once tranquil atmosphere had shifted into something that felt charged with an unspoken tension. It wasn't just the plane that was experiencing turbulence, it was the entire cabin. But it was only when the captain's voice came through the intercom that Angela truly began to sense the full weight of the situation. Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing some turbulence, and we kindly ask that you remain seated with your seatbelt fastened. We expect this to last for just a few minutes, so please remain calm. The captain's voice was calm and reassuring, but Angela couldn't shake the feeling that something else was happening, something that went beyond just the turbulence in the air. She couldn't quite place it, but she sensed the growing disquiet among the passengers. It was as if the weather outside was only a reflection of the storm brewing inside the cabin. Little did Angela know, her quiet existence on this flight would soon be interrupted in a way that no one could have predicted. A storm was indeed coming, but it wouldn't be one of nature's making. It was one of human prejudice, judgment, and suspicion. As the plane continued to shake, Angela's mind wandered. She wondered if her presence, her mere existence in first class, was enough to make some people uncomfortable. She had often wondered what it was about her that made others question her right to occupy certain spaces. It wasn't just her success, it was her skin, her background, her very identity. And as the turbulence outside grew more intense, so did the invisible storm inside the cabin. But Angela Hamilton, ever the composed and dignified woman, had no idea just how quickly the situation was about to escalate. Unseen forces. Angela's grip on the armrests tightened as the turbulence escalated, a familiar sensation growing more pronounced in her gut. Outside the windows, the clouds churned in unpredictable swirls, their darkened mass obscuring the sun. The plane jolted and dipped, and every few seconds, the loud rattle of the overhead compartments reminded her of the unsettled atmosphere inside the cabin. It was as if the sky itself was protesting the sudden unease that had taken hold of the plane. But Angela couldn't help feeling that the discomfort wasn't entirely due to the weather. Her senses were on high alert, picking up on the tension in the air that seemed to intensify with each passing moment. She could feel it, the subtle shift in how the passengers around her were reacting. A murmur of hushed voices, the quiet rustle of shifting bodies, the occasional glance thrown her way. It was all so familiar, and yet, it stung in a way she wasn't expecting. She shifted in her seat, trying to remain composed, but the weight of the situation was pressing in on her. The flight attendant had returned to her station but kept stealing glances toward Angela, her eyes narrowing with each look. Angela tried to tell herself it was nothing, just a routine interaction, a professional keeping tabs on all passengers. Yet, the more she thought about it, the more it felt like something was wrong, like there was a deeper current pulling at the edges of her reality. Suddenly, the flight attendant appeared at her side again, this time with a forced smile that didn't quite meet her eyes. "Ma'am," she said in a clipped tone, "I'm afraid we have to ask you to move to the back of the plane. We are experiencing some delays in the front section." Angela's eyebrows furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean? I'm in my seat, and I'm wearing my seatbelt. Why would I need to move?" The attendant didn't respond immediately. Instead, she seemed to hesitate, almost as if weighing her words. Angela could sense that this wasn't a simple request. There was something behind it, something unspoken. The attendant's eyes flickered toward the other passengers in first class, many of whom were still seated but now looked uncomfortably at Angela. "Ma'am, we insist," the attendant said, her voice now more insistent, though still carefully controlled. "It's for your own safety. We're trying to avoid any further complications with the turbulence." Angela's heart began to race, her mind whirling with questions. She had traveled on planes countless times, had weathered far worse turbulence, and never once had she been asked to move for safety reasons. Something about this was wrong, very wrong. The tension in the cabin, once subtle, was now palpable. The murmurs among the passengers were growing louder, and Angela felt the weight of their judgment in each of their glances. Her mind raced through all the scenarios she had faced in her life, the moments where she had been told she wasn't enough, that she didn't belong. This felt like one of those moments, only more overt. But why? Why was she being singled out? She wasn't doing anything wrong. She stared at the attendant, her mind calculating her response. Angela had worked her entire life to get to this point. She had earned every inch of space she occupied, every privilege she was entitled to. She wasn't about to let someone dictate her place on this flight, or in any other part of her life. "I'll stay where I am," Angela said, her voice calm but firm. "I've been asked to move before, and I understand the procedure. But I am not moving." The flight attendant blinked, caught off guard by the assertiveness in Angela's tone. For a split second, their eyes locked in a silent standoff. But the attendant wasn't done yet. "You really should listen," she said, her voice still polite, but with an edge of irritation creeping in. "It's the captain's orders. There's a reason why." Before the flight attendant could finish her sentence, the intercom crackled, and the captain's voice filled the cabin once again. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We are encountering a sudden change in weather conditions. The turbulence will likely continue for some time, but we ask for your patience and cooperation." Angela could feel the eyes of everyone in the cabin on her now. It wasn't just the flight attendant. The other passengers, too, seemed to be waiting for her next move. She was acutely aware of the scrutiny. She had always known that, as a black woman in a space like this, she would be watched, judged, and perhaps even underestimated. But this was different. This wasn't just passive observation, it was active judgment. And in the quiet, subtle whispers that had begun to circulate through the cabin, she could hear the harsh tone of unspoken doubt. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the turbulence wash over her. There were still 2 hours left in this flight. She had no idea how this encounter would unfold, but she knew this moment, this subtle, quiet injustice, was about to spark something far bigger than a routine flight. She wasn't going to let this slide. Not this time. Not when she knew the system was built on these tiny, persistent slights. As if on cue, another flight attendant, a tall, blonde woman with an air of arrogance, walked toward her. Angela immediately recognized the shift in her demeanor. It was a look of concern, sure, but more than that, it was a judgment. There was an expectation that Angela would be subservient, docile, or at the very least, accommodating. But Angela wasn't about to give in to that expectation. Not this time. "I'm sorry, but you'll have to move," the blonde flight attendant said, her tone even more insistent. "There are strict regulations about passenger distribution, and we can't allow anyone to remain in this section without proper authorization." Angela tilted her head slightly, as if considering the request. She could hear the murmurs intensifying around her. The other passengers had begun to whisper, and she knew they were waiting for her to comply. This wasn't just about moving to the back of the plane. It was about testing her submission, pushing her to accept a narrative that wasn't true. The truth was simple, she belonged here, just as much as anyone else. "I'm not moving," Angela said again, her voice unwavering. "I'm in the seat I paid for, and I will stay here until we land. If you have an issue with that, I suggest you speak to the captain." The flight attendant's eyes narrowed, and Angela could see the frustration building. But just as the attendant opened her mouth to respond, another voice broke through the tension. "Excuse me, ma'am," came the voice of a man from a few rows behind. "Is there a problem here?" Angela turned toward the voice, surprised to see a well-dressed man standing in the aisle, his expression one of quiet authority. He was tall, middle-aged, with a calm yet assertive demeanor. He was dressed in a crisp suit, his face displaying no sign of discomfort despite the turbulence. Something about him exuded confidence. The flight attendant, visibly thrown off, seemed to pause, as if unsure whether to engage with the new arrival. She opened her mouth to speak, but the man didn't wait for her to finish. "Look, I've been watching this unfold, and I have to say, there's no reason this woman should be treated this way," he said, his voice clear, every word carrying weight. "I've been flying for years, and I've seen plenty of turbulence. There's no reason to single anyone out. She's perfectly entitled to sit where she is." The flight attendant blinked in surprise, clearly caught off guard by the intervention. But Angela could see that this wasn't just a random passenger defending her. This man knew something. He understood something that the rest of the passengers didn't, something about standing up, even when the odds seemed stacked against you. For the first time since the encounter had begun, Angela allowed herself a brief smile. She hadn't expected any support, certainly not from the other passengers. But in that moment, the storm that had been brewing in the cabin seemed to lose some of its strength. The subtle forces of prejudice, doubt, and fear had met an unexpected resistance. The flight attendant, visibly rattled, took a step back, as though uncertain of how to proceed. Angela sat tall in her seat, her back straight, her heart pounding, but her resolve stronger than ever. The flight was far from over, but Angela knew this moment was only the beginning. The real turbulence was just about to begin. The unseen battle. The plane continued to shake, its violent tremors reverberating through Angela's body, but in that moment, she no longer felt vulnerable. There was something empowering in the air, something had shifted inside her, and it wasn't just the sudden support of the man who had spoken up. It was the realization that she no longer had to sit in silence, playing by the rules set by others. As the turbulence continued, Angela looked around the cabin, her eyes scanning the faces of the passengers. She saw the subtle shifts in body language, the tension that had settled in everyone's shoulders, but she also saw something else, an opportunity for change. The whispers of discomfort had transformed into something more palpable. There was a quiet buzz of uncertainty, as though people were beginning to question what had been accepted as normal. The plane was filled with an invisible, simmering resistance, a resistance she could tap into. But it wasn't just the turbulence that had rattled the cabin, it was her. Angela's refusal to comply with the flight attendant's instructions, her quiet stand against the subtle injustice, had begun to echo through the rows of seats. She had ignited something in the people around her, though none of them had quite put their finger on it. Some passengers shifted in their seats, unsure of how to react. Others were watching the interaction intently, waiting for the next move. Angela had inadvertently made this flight something much more than a simple trip between destinations. It had become a moment of reckoning. The man who had spoken up for her earlier remained standing, still calm but with a presence that commanded attention. He was unbothered by the continued turbulence, as if nothing could shake his composure. Angela could see in his eyes that he wasn't just some random passenger sticking up for her, he was someone who understood what was at stake. "I'll have a word with the captain," he said, his tone unwavering. "This needs to be resolved. This is not how we treat people, especially not on a plane. Especially not in 2024. Angela could feel the weight of his words sink in. She hadn't expected this kind of support from anyone, least of all a stranger on a plane. She had been prepared to fight this battle on her own, but now, it felt as though the tide was beginning to turn in her favor. The flight attendant, who had been so adamant moments before, now seemed uncertain. She was caught between doing what she had been instructed to do and what she knew, deep down, was wrong. Her eyes darted nervously between Angela and the man standing up for her, as if unsure of how to proceed. But the truth was that the moment had shifted. No longer was it just about an isolated passenger in the wrong seat. It was about something much larger. It was about the power dynamics at play, the systems of inequality that had been normalized for so long. Angela settled deeper into her seat, letting her breath steady as she realized that the battle wasn't over, it had only just begun. She wasn't going to give up her ground so easily. Not this time. "Ma'am, I really must insist," the flight attendant said again, though her voice was now weaker, hesitant. "If you refuse to comply with the captain's orders, I will be forced to take further action. You may be removed from the flight upon arrival." Angela's heart rate quickened, but her mind remained clear. The words stung, but she could hear the desperation in the flight attendant's tone. It was the sound of someone trying to hold on to control in a situation that was quickly spiraling out of their grasp. It was a moment of powerlessness masked by authority. Angela was keenly aware of it, and she was no longer intimidated. "I'll stay right here," Angela said, her voice firm but not angry. "I've done nothing wrong. If there's an issue with my presence here, it needs to be addressed by the proper people. Until then, I am not moving." The tension in the air grew thicker as the minutes passed. The man, who had returned to his seat, watched the interaction unfold, his gaze sharp. Angela caught his eye and gave him a small, appreciative nod. It wasn't lost on her that he had stood up for her, but it wasn't just about him. It was about what she had become, someone who was no longer going to accept the silence, who was no longer going to be complicit in the systems that sought to push her down. The flight attendant, realizing that her efforts were futile, turned on her heel and walked away, her steps heavy with frustration. But the damage had already been done. The spark that Angela had ignited was growing, spreading through the cabin in quiet waves. The once subtle murmurs had now transformed into open discussions. Passengers exchanged glances, some in agreement with Angela, others unsure of where they stood. But the atmosphere had shifted. It was no longer just about her, it was about everyone who had ever been overlooked, silenced, or made to feel like they didn't belong. The remainder of the flight passed in a tense, uncomfortable silence, though Angela couldn't shake the sense that something important was happening. Her stand had rippled through the cabin, leaving an indelible mark. As the plane began its descent, the fastened seatbelt sign flickered on again, but Angela didn't move. She had already proven what she needed to prove. It wasn't until the plane touched down that Angela was fully aware of how much she had changed in that brief span of time. As the passengers began to disembark, she stayed seated, her mind still processing what had just happened. The man who had stood up for her passed by her seat, giving her a knowing nod as he exited. "Thank you," Angela said, her voice filled with gratitude. "No need to thank me," the man replied with a soft smile. "We all have a role to play. You've done more than enough." Angela watched him leave the plane, her thoughts racing. She had faced a system of inequality that had been designed to keep her down, but in that brief exchange, something profound had shifted. She had reminded herself, and everyone around her, that no one could dictate her place in this world. As Angela stood up to gather her things, she couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet satisfaction. The flight had been anything but ordinary. She had gone from being the subject of suspicion to becoming a force of change. But as she made her way down the aisle, Angela's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, checking the message that had just come through. It was from her business partner, Robert. "Angela, something big just came across my desk. I think you'll want to see this." Angela's heart skipped a beat as she read the message. The next few words she read were a stark reminder that her work had only just begun. It wasn't over yet. This was just the beginning of something much bigger. The unexpected revelation. Angela stepped off the plane, her mind still racing from the events that had unfolded in the air. The fight she had just engaged in felt surreal, as if she had been standing on the edge of something, daring it to fall. It had been the quietest form of rebellion, simple, firm resistance against an unjust, unspoken system. But as she walked down the gangway and into the terminal, the reality of what had happened started to settle in. The air felt different here on the ground, more grounded, more tangible, like everything was aligned with the weight of the small battle she had fought. It wasn't just about not moving when told to, it was about asserting her space in a world that often tried to take it away. It was about every person who had ever been told they didn't belong, every marginalized individual who had been expected to shrink themselves in the face of judgment. In her small act of defiance, Angela had found not just her own power, but the power that could be harnessed by so many others. She paused for a moment, taking in the bustling terminal. People rushed past her, on their way to meetings, planes, and destinations. But for the first time in a long time, Angela felt as though she had a destination of her own. It wasn't a physical place, not exactly, but a mental and emotional space that was hers to define. The turbulence on the plane had unsettled her, but it had also illuminated something inside her, a purpose she hadn't fully realized until now. She took a deep breath, letting it out slowly, the way she'd learned to do in moments of uncertainty. It was then that she felt her phone vibrate again in her hand. Pulling it out, she saw that Robert, her business partner, had sent her another message. Her heart skipped a beat as she clicked on it. "Angela, something big just came across my desk. You need to see this. It's urgent." The urgency in his words wasn't lost on her. The text left an unspoken promise of revelation, a signal that something significant was happening in the background, something that perhaps tied into the storm she had just weathered. What could be so pressing that it warranted his attention after the drama of the flight? Without a moment's hesitation, Angela found a quiet corner in the terminal and called Robert. She didn't wait for the phone to ring twice before he picked up. "Angela," Robert's voice was filled with tension, "I know you're just off a flight, but I need you to hear this. It's about the company you've been keeping an eye on, the airline." Angela's stomach tightened. She had been watching a certain airline for months, carefully eyeing its financials and its leadership team. The airline had recently been in the news for a number of reasons, some positive, some negative, but Angela had always suspected that there was more to the story. She had sensed that the company was teetering on the brink of change, perhaps due to internal instability or shifting market dynamics. But what did Robert have to say now? "Robert, tell me everything," Angela said, her voice steady, betraying none of the apprehension she felt. Robert hesitated before continuing. "It's a mess. And it's bigger than you think. There's been some questionable behavior at the highest levels." "The flight you were just on?" "It wasn't an isolated incident. There's a pattern, and I'm not sure how it's connected yet, but it looks like the airline has been in some deep trouble for a while." "The pilot you mentioned?" "He's been under investigation for misconduct in other cities, and now the company's hiding it." Angela's heart raced as she listened to Robert's words. The man who had supported her on the plane, the one who had spoken up, might not have been the only one aware of the deeper issues within the airline. The whole situation felt like more than just an isolated incident, it was part of a much larger problem. "Robert, what do you mean by hiding it? Are you saying this is systemic?" Angela's voice hardened with concern. "Are these people I encountered on that flight, part of a larger scheme? What are they covering up?" "I'm not entirely sure yet," Robert replied, his voice lowering. "But I know enough to tell you that your confrontation on that flight, it wasn't just a random issue. That was a reaction. The flight attendant, the captain, all of it. They were testing you. Seeing if you would stand down. This isn't just about a seat on a plane anymore, Angela. You've stumbled onto something much bigger than you imagined. And it's connected to the power structure of the airline itself." Angela felt her breath catch. She had known something wasn't right, but to hear Robert confirm it, to hear that the forces at play were far more calculated than she had anticipated, was unsettling. This wasn't just about a minor inconvenience or a flight attendant's attitude. It was about power. It was about control. It was about making sure that people like her, people who didn't belong in certain spaces, didn't disrupt the carefully constructed order. Angela closed her eyes for a moment, taking in the gravity of what Robert had revealed. Her instincts had been right. She had been a part of something larger than herself, and the stakes were far higher than she had imagined. She wasn't just dealing with a couple of bigoted individuals. She was dealing with a systemic problem, a corporate structure that used prejudice as a tool to maintain its grip on power. The very thing that had happened to her on the flight, the subtle but insidious discrimination, was a reflection of a larger narrative playing out within the airline industry itself. "This is bigger than a few bad apples," Angela said, her voice now low and resolute. "I need to see the full picture, Robert. All the files. Every last piece of information you have. I want to understand exactly how deep this goes. And I need to know if there's any way to stop it." Robert paused for a moment before responding. "I'll send you everything I have. But Angela, you need to be careful. There's a lot at stake here. These are powerful people with a lot to lose. If you start digging too deep, they'll try to shut you down. But I trust you. I think you're the one who can do something about it." Angela's mind raced, her thoughts clicking into place. She wasn't just an observer anymore. She wasn't just a passenger on this flight through life. She had become part of a movement, a force that was capable of breaking through the systems that sought to suppress others. "I'm not backing down, Robert," she said, her voice firm. "This ends now." As she ended the call and slipped the phone back into her pocket, Angela couldn't help but feel that the battle she had started on that flight had now turned into something more substantial. The turbulence in the skies was a metaphor for what was unfolding beneath the surface, and she had become a catalyst for change. But she also knew this was only the beginning. The system that sought to suppress people like her was vast, far-reaching, and insidious. To dismantle it, she would have to go beyond the surface level of corporate politics. She would have to dive into the darkest corners of the industry and challenge the status quo. But she was ready. Angela wasn't just going to survive this storm, she was going to change the skies forever. The airline was about to learn that a storm was coming that it wouldn't be able to outrun. And Angela Hamilton was at the center of it all. The fight for change. Angela Hamilton stood at the precipice of something monumental, the kind of transformation she had always believed was possible, but had never imagined would happen so quickly. The news that Robert had uncovered about the airline wasn't just shocking, it was infuriating. What had seemed like a moment of personal injustice on the flight had turned into a corporate conspiracy that spanned far beyond the single encounter. She had always been the kind of person who made things happen. A self-made entrepreneur, Angela had faced rejection, bigotry, and doubt throughout her life, but she had used those challenges as fuel to propel herself to success. It wasn't just about making money for Angela, it was about creating a space where others, particularly those who had been excluded and overlooked, could thrive. That philosophy had driven her to the heights she had achieved in her business, but now, the same philosophy was urging her to take on a new kind of battle. The wind outside was heavy with the promise of rain, and Angela watched the storm clouds gathering as she stood in the glass-walled corner of her office. She had spent the better part of the afternoon reviewing the files Robert had sent her. The deeper she dug, the more layers she uncovered of a corrupt system that had been hiding in plain sight. The airline wasn't just a company facing turbulence in its business strategy, it was a machine designed to exploit, discriminate, and perpetuate inequality. The more she learned, the more the pieces fell into place. The flight attendants, the pilots, and even some of the higher-ups in the corporate offices had been complicit in a network of discrimination. It was systematic. It was deliberate. The airline had a long history of excluding people of color, particularly in first class, not just through passive bias, but through an active, calculated effort to make sure people like Angela felt they didn't belong. What had happened to her on that flight was a microcosm of a much larger, deeply ingrained culture of prejudice that was woven into the fabric of the company. It wasn't just one bad employee, it was the entire system that had been built to marginalize, to create an environment where people who didn't fit a certain image, a certain demographic, were pushed to the edges. Angela didn't just feel the weight of what had happened to her personally, she felt the weight of what had happened to so many others who had been subjected to the same treatment. She was no longer just angry at the flight attendant who had confronted her, or the pilot who had failed to intervene. She was angry at the institution that had allowed this behavior to fester and grow unchecked for so long. But anger, she knew, was just the beginning. She had learned to channel her frustration into action over the years. The first step, she realized, was to gain leverage. If she was going to bring about any change, she would have to go straight to the heart of the airline and confront its leaders. But she couldn't do that without a strategy. Her phone buzzed again, and she glanced down at the screen. It was another message from Robert. "Angela, I've got something big. It's about the CEO. I think this could be the key. I'll meet you tomorrow morning at your office. We need to talk." Angela's pulse quickened. The CEO. The very person at the helm of this broken ship. If she could get to him, if she could expose his role in this mess, she might have the power to change everything. The next morning, Angela sat in her office, her mind sharp and focused. The weight of the challenge ahead wasn't lost on her. But she wasn't intimidated. She had dealt with systems of inequality before, systems that were much bigger and more entrenched than a single airline. But what made this different was that this time, she was standing at the front of the battle, not behind the scenes. Robert arrived just after 9, his demeanor tense as he walked into the office. He didn't waste any time getting to the point. "Angela, I found something," Robert said, placing a folder on her desk. "It's about the CEO, Jordan Sinclair. He's been involved in some questionable activities. I have some evidence of his involvement in suppressing diversity initiatives within the company. He's behind a lot of this. If we can get him on the record, if we can expose what he's done, it could unravel the whole thing." Angela took the folder from him and flipped it open, her eyes scanning the documents inside. Robert had pulled together a detailed case, complete with emails, meeting notes, and testimony from employees who had been silenced or dismissed when they raised concerns about the company's discriminatory practices. It was clear from the evidence that Sinclair had been directly involved in fostering a toxic, exclusionary culture. He had, time and again, blocked initiatives designed to bring diversity into leadership roles and had used his power to shield certain employees from accountability. "This is huge, Robert," Angela said, her voice steady but filled with urgency. "We have everything we need to bring this to the surface." "But there's more," Robert added, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The company's board has been complicit. They've allowed Sinclair to continue his reign unchecked. But if we can expose him, if we can show the board what's been going on, we might just have a chance to force a change." Angela's mind raced as she processed this new information. The stakes had just been raised. It wasn't just about Sinclair, it was about everyone who had enabled him, everyone who had turned a blind eye to the discrimination that had been going on for years. "I'm not going to just expose Sinclair," Angela said, her voice resolute. "I'm going after the entire system. I'm going to make sure that everyone who's been involved in this knows they're accountable. If we're going to make this company change, we need to hit them where it hurts." Robert nodded in agreement. "You're right. But we need to be careful. We can't just storm in and start making demands. We need to make sure we have the support. We need the media, the public, and the employees behind us." Angela nodded, already thinking ahead. She had connections, journalists who had written about corporate corruption before, influencers who could bring public attention to their cause. The press would be key in making sure the story got out, and once it did, the company's reputation would be irrevocably tarnished. "We'll start with the employees," Angela said, making a decision. "We'll use the evidence to rally them. They've been living under Sinclair's thumb for far too long. It's time for them to rise up and speak out." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Angela, with Robert by her side, worked tirelessly behind the scenes to expose the truth. They leaked the evidence to key journalists, coordinated meetings with whistleblowers inside the company, and developed a strategy to bring the issue directly to the public. Every step was carefully calculated, there was no room for error. Finally, the day came when the story broke. The media coverage was swift and damning. News outlets across the country picked up the story, shining a light on the toxic culture within the airline. Employees came forward, some anonymously, others on the record, sharing their experiences of systemic discrimination, retaliation for speaking out, and the rampant bias that had shaped the company's operations. The public's reaction was immediate and fierce, outrage spread like wildfire. But the most explosive moment came when a former executive from the company, someone who had been silently complicit in Sinclair's actions, came forward with an interview that would change everything. This former executive revealed that Sinclair had not only fostered the company's exclusionary practices, but had also personally intervened to block any attempt at reform. The pressure mounted, and within days, the airline's board was forced to take action. Jordan Sinclair was removed from his position as CEO, and an emergency meeting was called to address the company's internal failures. The board announced a series of sweeping changes, including a complete overhaul of the company's diversity and inclusion policies and the implementation of new leadership at the top. But Angela wasn't done yet. Her goal was never just about seeing Sinclair fall, it was about ensuring that the system he had built was completely dismantled. She wasn't satisfied with cosmetic changes. She wanted real reform, and she knew that the battle wasn't over until she had secured a promise that the company would become a place where everyone could truly belong. As she stood before the press, giving her first public statement since the revelations had rocked the company, Angela knew that this was just the beginning. The storm had come, and she had weathered it. Now, she was the one who was rebuilding the skies. The fight for equality had taken on a new shape, and Angela Hamilton was at its heart, fighting not just for herself, but for every voice that had ever been silenced. The winds of change were here, and they weren't going anywhere.